the end of the Second World War, when the deprivations were over, the generation after the Second World War, they were known as baby boomers. They called that because they had lots of babies, and secondly because I think perhaps coming out of the deprivations of the Second World War, they wanted their children to want for nothing. In fact, they spoiled them. They gave them everything they wanted and more. So these children were brought up in the lap of luxury, a whole generation or two, and you would have expected that that would have induced in them an acceptance of the values of their parents. Now, what were the values of their parents in the 50s? Late 50s. Father was the breadwinner. Mother, with apron on, was in the kitchen, the homemaker, looking after the kids. That was her role. And if you look at the mass advertising at that time, you'll see these images again and again. And of course, this is based on the unitary family. Something had happened during the Second World War, which I think people only realize with hindsight. And that was that when all the men were drafted to go off and fight overseas, the factories at home and work at home required labor. Men were not to be had, so women were mobilized. During the Second World War, if you read the history of the United States, you'll find how women, a whole generation of women, were mobilized in the workplace. Those very homemakers. Now, when you have a situation of so-called return to normality, and you want to now send those women back into the kitchen and back into the roles as homemakers, there is an inherent conflict here somewhere. Because once you bring somebody out of the home, जिसको हम चादर और चार दीवारी कहते हैं हमारी जुबान में, and you put them in the public space, in the workplace, and perhaps give them a career, then you have brought about a change which arguably is irreversible. And to add to that, this whole generation coming out of the war, women who had worked, so perhaps they were not as willing to accept a docile secondary homemaker role, wife, mother, as perhaps their mothers were. Add to that the fact that these baby boomer parents sent their children, gave their children the best possible education, up to and including higher education, that money could buy. So, you had a situation where a whole generation of women had been put in the workplace of necessity because of the war, and now you were trying to bring them back to the same role of wife, mother, homemaker in the kitchen. And so there was going to be inevitably a conflict. Now, the second factor which changes things in the United States of America is that post-war, this baby boomer parents' generation is now sending their children to school, of course, high school, everybody did that, but also to higher education, college and university. And this means boys and girls both. So a whole generation, or at least a large bulk of that generation of girls, is now highly educated and primed and ready for careers. Now that brings about a change in society itself. It's a big departure. So what you're seeing is a demographic change. You're seeing a social change. You're seeing a gender role change. All these things are accumulating below the surface. Now it kind of emerges, if you like, into the open in the 60s, particularly the mid-60s. What happens? These children, lacking for nothing, spoiled, have everything and more, everything they wanted. Suddenly, having gone through this transformative process of having everything, having education, even higher education, now turn around, these ingrates, and reject the values of their parents. There is a cultural revolution without any Mao. Without any revolution, okay? What's the cultural revolution? Culture changes, life styles, values, All those things are thrown up into the air, assessed, reassessed, critiqued, and many of them rejected. So, you hear fashionably about the hippie generation, for instance. What were they doing? They were rejecting their parents' lifestyle and exploring a completely different one, outside the norms of society, commune-based in many instances, and of course many other things, which we'll get into. So there is a change in culture and values going on. So lifestyle change, what you want to do with your life change. Music had a big role in this, the kind of music that was produced in the 60s. I don't know whether it was intended to, but it certainly induced rebellion in all of us against our parents' values. And I happened to be in England at the time, so I experienced it, perhaps not as intensely as some people may have in the United States, but certainly in terms of influence. Now, what did that mean? That meant not only that you were rejecting the values, i.e. unitary family, the call was free sex, okay? And at that time nobody had heard of AIDS, so nobody worried about it. You had change in the way people presented themselves, the clothes they wore, the grooming they had, the way they looked. You had a rejection of the unitary family, as I said. So the home in which the roles are assigned is gone for that generation. Along with this counterculture comes obviously far greater awareness of the world. People are traveling more than ever. People are bringing back other cultures, the difference, and seeing the world in a completely different perspective. The United States is such a huge country. It's more like a continent. And if you ever visited it over the years, you would have realized that by and large it's very parochial. People are confined to their locality and may not know very much about the rest of the world. That parochialism broke down. At least briefly, I would say. I don't know if it's the case that it sustained itself, but anyway. So learning about the world and learning about what was going on, and then every evening watching the war in Vietnam from the battlefield, I think that produced a profound effect on that generation. Now, there was also the factor of the draft, conscript army. Every able-bodied young man was expected, and this was something that stemmed from the Second World War, was expected to serve if called upon. Now, this generation who is rebelling against the values of its parents, going towards a different lifestyle, different set of values, different ways of doing things, now suddenly is confronted with the conscription, the draft, and expected to go off to this remote Southeast Asian small country and fight a war which initially is sold as patriotic duty because you're stopping communism. But the realities of the conflict and the horrible nature of that conflict, it was a very cruel war on the part of the Americans. Indiscriminate killing, massacre, so on and so forth. They had superior armaments, they had air, they had every conceivable weapon. And they didn't hesitate to make mincemeat of anyone who came in their path. So it was a very, very cruel war. I think those images came back, and I think those images had a great deal to do with the way opinion in the United States began to change and reject this war. It wasn't making sense. The aims were not making sense anymore, the means were not making sense anymore, and they were being rejected on the grounds of how horrible they were. Now this generation of young Americans being conscripted, young men being conscripted, rebels. And the first rebellion begins on the campuses of the universities and colleges. So words that you today take for granted, like teach-ins and sit-ins, originate in that period in the United States. And of course, then they spread. By 1968, when in February, the Vietnamese launched their Tet Offensive, which is a generalized uprising throughout South Vietnam, and which briefly at least takes some cities, including the old imperial capital Hue, and blows a big hole through the claims of the American generals that they are winning the war, and the enemy is on the run and defeated, its backbone is broken, etc., etc. All this propaganda वो tet offensive में ढेर हो गया. Not only is the resistance alive and kicking, it is more powerful, stronger than ever. So the voices of dissent in the United States of America, in the Western world, and all over the world, which are starting to reject this war, suddenly emerge and say, basta, enough. This is a movement that circumnavigates the globe. It arrives on the shores of Britain too, and yours truly sitting in its path. I'm becoming more and more political, more and more radical, because of my reading, because of my, awareness of things. And so one day, I'm in the habit of going on and on about these things to my friends. And one day a friend turns to me and says, "You talk a lot. How about doing something about it?" That taunt changed my life. I decided, okay, time to do something about it. So I joined the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign. This was a campaign, a worldwide campaign, in which we were seeking to end the war, get the Americans out of Vietnam, and allow the Vietnamese people to decide their own fate themselves, which was what, the 1954 Geneva conferences were about. Return to that. So in October 1968, just before October 1968, I joined this campaign. They assigned me to their local chapter in Earl's Court, where I lived, and we began to organize for the big demo in October. And that meant street corner meetings and soapbox oratory, at which I became reasonably adept. Standing on a street corner in front of the tube station and regaling the passing crowds with our ideas. We got a lot of hostility also, but we also got support. And so that October 68 demonstration in London was at that point the largest demonstration ever seen in that country. Bigger ones have happened since, but that was a turning point. But unfortunately, as often happens on the left, and this was essentially a left movement, differences and splits are inevitable. The left is notorious for that. And here too, there was a split between one faction led by people like Tariq Ali, who wanted this to be a peaceful demonstration, go to Hyde Park and sound off and go home. And a more militant faction which wanted to go to the US Embassy across the park in Grosvenor Square and confront the Americans' symbol of authority in London. So there was a split. So 2/3 went to Hyde Park, I have to admit. And 1/3, including me, went to Grosvenor Square, where we were confronted by policemen blocking our path, whose cordon we then tried to break, got beaten up for our pains, didn't succeed in getting into the embassy. But yes, it was my first experience of political organizing, political action, and actual confrontation with state authority. I would say that just as 1968 was a seminal year, a turning point, I think, in the history of the world, in many respects, it was certainly a turning point and a seminal year in my life. My first acquaintance, as I said, with political activism, with organization, confronting state authority, getting beat up for my pains, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, immediately after that big October demonstration in London, my chapter of the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign fell victim to the usual disease on the left, which is differences, splits, fights, all kinds of things. The meetings used to be held in my flat, and eventually, tiring of having my chairs broken in every meeting, I decided to dispense with my participation. And I must admit, rather disillusioned by the behavior of some of the people in that campaign who I thought were very rigid and dogmatic and not prepared to listen to or debate differing opinions. This too has been a characteristic on much of the left in its history. So I was feeling rather low and depressed when I was then introduced to a group of Pakistani students and workers who were thinking along the lines of what should be done about our country back home. And in our discussions, we decided that something must be done. Now, this is a period when in Pakistan, a movement sparked off by students has spread through the length and breadth of both wings of the country. It's a huge agitation. It begins with students, it draws in members of the intelligentsia and middle class, and eventually it draws in the working class and its trade unions. Many instances also of rural mobilization, peasant mobilization. The whole country is seething with protest, resentment against the Ayub Khan dictatorship, which had lasted 10 years and was, in fact, the regime was celebrating 10 years of having been in power and calling it a great triumph of development and so on. Ironically, it is at that particular moment when this movement broke out. So obviously, as students and workers in Pakistan who were concerned about what was going on back home, this movement was an inspiration also that, after 10 years of relative quiet, here was the country exploding. Now I have to go back and explain something to you. In 1964, when I was in government college, as I told you, for a year, not doing very much studying, just having a good time, waiting to leave for England, there was an agitation amongst the students of Pakistan against the Ayub regime's attempt to change the BA course, which normally after matriculation would have taken you 4 years, 2 years FA, 2 years BA. They wanted to change it to 3 years, 2 years FA, 3 years BA. It was called the University Reforms Ordinance or something, as I recall. Now, there was a great deal of agitation amongst the students against this because it meant an extra year in education. And, some students obviously were hard put to do 4 years, let alone 5. Plus the waste of time, so considered a waste of time. So this agitation was bubbling. And I remember there was a demonstration called by students led by a government college in which I participated. It was a peaceful demonstration on the Mall. Now this is long before 68, okay? I'm a very young, green behind the ears kid, just recently joined government college. And it was a peaceful demonstration on the Mall. The police didn't attempt to stop it or in any way attack it. But then by the time we reached government college, back to government college, the police then decided to go into the campus or try to go into the campus and arrest the ringleaders of this protest. At which the head of the college, Dr. Rashed Rahman, who was very popular amongst the students because he was very sympathetic to students and to their concerns and so on, very protective of them like a father. He took a stand and he had the gates of the college closed and refused to allow the police in. So there was a bit of a confrontation in front of Government College with the police. I remember that. I wasn't part of it, I was watching it from inside, but I remember that. So some activism, embryonic, was there, but 68 was the turning point. When this group of students and workers, Pakistani students and workers, finally got organized along the lines of trying to do something back home, it became a serious group. We took out a journal, a monthly journal, which was called Pakistan Zindabad, ironically, because it wasn't going to remain Pakistan Zindabad for very long. Don't forget, this is just 2 years before the crisis in East Pakistan. Now, even then, when we were taking out this journal, we began to discern what in the literature is called the national question in Pakistan. What does that mean? Our reading or our study of the history of Pakistan indicated to us that the structure of the state had been at the heart of many, if not all, of the problems that Pakistan had faced since it came into being. What do I mean? I mean, whether it's going to be a federal state with powers to the provinces. Now, a bit of background might help. At the time when the independence movement was going on, Mr. Jinnah and the Muslim League were arguing for provincial autonomy. Why were they arguing for provincial autonomy? Because in many provinces of United India, Muslims were in a majority. And they felt that if they had a structure of the existing colonial state and certainly the post-colonial independent state that will emerge. At that time, we were still thinking of one India. We hadn't yet come down to the position of wanting a separate state. That happened in 1940. So the question of provincial autonomy really went to the heart of the Muslim aspiration or the Muslim demand for rights within a united India and not be swamped by a majority which was Hindu. This was something like 33%, the Muslims of United India. So it was a very large minority, not to be sneezed at. And so these things, I mean, it's a long history, I won't get into that. But basically, the reason I'm stating this is because once Pakistan came into being, the very party and leadership that had fought for provincial autonomy within a united India during the independence movement suddenly became insensitive to provincial autonomy in the new state. Now, how did it manifest itself? In 1948, Mr. Jinnah went to East Pakistan. He gave a speech there in which he argued that Urdu would be the national language of Pakistan. The Bengalis, of course, revolted against this. After his death, a student movement started. Students were shot and killed, and so the whole language movement of East Pakistan began there. Also in 1948, the issue of Balochistan's accession to Pakistan, which had been hanging fire since before independence, came to a head. The Khan of Kalat in his autobiography says that he was forced to sign the instrument of accession. He had no mandate for it from his people, but he was forced. And of course, there was a rebellion, an armed rebellion against that in Balochistan, and Balochistan has never settled down since. We are still at war in Balochistan. In what is today Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, at that time was known as Northwest Frontier Province, the predominant movement that had led the independence struggle was the Khudai Khidmatgar or Red Shirts of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, Asfandiar's grandfather, and Khan Abdul Wali Khan's father. And he was known as the Frontier Gandhi because he was very influenced by Gandhi's ideas, non-violence, satyagraha, passive resistance, all that. Now, they wanted a choice. They wanted a choice not necessarily to be with Pakistan. Obviously, in the climate obtaining before and just around independence, this was not a popular view as far as the Muslim League was concerned. And in 47, if I have the date right, a referendum was held in NWFP to decide the matter. The red shirts boycotted it, and Mr. Khan, Abdul Qayyum Khan of the Muslim League, they say, manipulated that referendum and used it as the basis for NWFP becoming part of Pakistan. So now the irony is Sindh. Sindh is the province in which the Muslim League in 1942 in its provincial assembly moves a resolution authored by Mr. G.M. Sayyid, no less, who was a major figure in the Muslim League, for Sindh to join Pakistan. The only assembly in what became Pakistan later to have done this. Ironically, once Pakistan came into being and Sayyid became disillusioned, became a Sindhi nationalist and gave birth to the GA Sindh movement, which is still around today. In Punjab, you had the party of the Punjabi landlords in Pak, called the Unionist Party, which, despite that, was secular in its outlook. It incorporated within its ranks not just Muslims, but all the denominations, faiths that of citizens that lived in Punjab, which included Hindus, included Sikhs, it included Christians, and so on and so forth. Now, they were not particularly enamored of the Muslim League to begin with, but when Muslim League gained momentum in the independence movement, they then came onto the bandwagon, I think in 1946, and in a sense merged themselves with the Muslim League. So you can see a very disparate and different picture of the provinces as they came together to constitute what became Pakistan. And these issues had not been resolved before the state came into being. If anything, they reared their head soon after the state came into being, and we have been wrestling with these problems ever since. This is an awareness that came to us when we studied Pakistan, studied its history, and began to become aware of what had taken place earlier during the independence movement and soon after independence and right up to date. By 1970, when the elections took place in Pakistan, the 1970 elections are credited with being arguably the most free and fair. And why was that? Despite the fact that Yahya Khan was in power as a military dictator and there was martial law in the country. The reason was that Yahya inherited the debris of the movement that was responsible or that was contributory to the overthrow of Ayub Khan. The overthrow did not replace Ayub Khan with a democratic regime. It replaced Ayub Khan with another military regime. The military asked Ayub to go home, and Yahya, the commander-in-chief, took over. Now Yahya was confronted with a country up in arms. The extent, 7 months of agitation in every city, every town, every village, every place in Pakistan confronted him with a few very serious problems. And so to diffuse that movement and diffuse any violent manifestations, he did one or two things, three things in fact. First, there was a rebellion going on in Balochistan, as usual. Governor of West Pakistan, Noor Khan, ex-Air Force chief, was charged with the duty of diffusing that situation. He came to an agreement with the Baloch guerrillas, ceasefire, and then what followed soon after, on the basis of assurances, was the announcement of the elections in 1970 and the breakup of one unit. Now, what is one unit? One unit was the merging of all the provinces of West Pakistan, obliterating the provinces of West Pakistan and making West Pakistan one unit. That was done in the 56 Constitution. Why was it done? It was done because a majority of the population, like it or not, resided in East Pakistan despite its smaller size. So if you had one man, one vote, East Pakistan was likely to dominate. The Bengalis were likely to dominate.